um, really it actually started during this time. There was a bit more digital freedom. Tibetans used like WhatsApp and microblogging sites. And following the Tibetan uprising, there were a lot of Tibetan intellectuals participating in discussions about how to promote Tibetan culture, because they're seeing it as being under attack under current Chinese policies. So, um, like, I'm part of Lhakar Diaries, and there's actually a section on our About section in terms of how the movement was founded by a specific blogger who basically announced every Wednesday as a day for Tibetans to actually reflect on their cultural heritage and history and to actively engage that heritage. So it initially started from like a digital messaging. Inside Tibet, around the same time, there were Tibetan youth groups starting their own little groups to, basically activate their Tibetan cultural heritage and history. It was actively as a way to kind of resist the Chinese assimilation policy, and also an active resistant, like primarily a nonviolent resistant against the Chinese state's policies concerning Tibetan culture. Well, I think the movement started with the uprising. And what we learned from the uprising is that, following the March 2008 uprising, I remember actually that there were still protests like against the Chinese state in parts of Ondo even after 3 months since it began in Assad. So to me, Lhakar is entirely motivated by what Tibetans witnessed and experienced and participated in during the 2008 uprising. And that uprising was specifically against Chinese policies. What we know from the 2000s is China promoted the Develop the West as in Tibet program, and that brought in heavy infrastructural development and heavy encroachment from the central government on like rural autonomy and freedom. So I think Lhakar became an avenue for Tibetans to continue that movement, refusing such assimilatory policies, but in a more, by activating their rights avenue. And the uprising was straight up, rejecting Chinese occupation of Tibet. And I think Lhakar became an easier avenue for Tibetans to still celebrate their identity while, subverting Chinese policies against outright resentment against the state. So in many ways, China says that Tibet has autonomy, cultural autonomy. So I think they're just engaging, their right to assert their identity and their right to be Tibetan inside Tibet through the Lhakar movement. I think it went from being a straight-up uprising rebellion to a non-cooperative movement that was blurry enough for the state to not be able to kind of clamp down on because they weren't right-out aggressive protests against the state, but they were definitely about empowering Tibetan cultural heritage and history and local nationalism, but through the activation of cultural heritage. So I think it becomes an easier thing to engage than like an outright protest, even though that's like also a thing. But I think this allows all Tibetans to participate without feeling like they're completely giving up on their like safety. This is technically under the rights of autonomy. Technically, they're allowed to do this, and even then, we're still seeing, local state clamp down on these cultural movements because they see this as a threat. So exactly because it's a threat that it's powerful. Do I think that it's a seemingly milder medium? I don't think so. Um, I don't really think it needs to be compared. I think the Lhakar movement, to me, initiates a return to Tibetans to empower themselves through cultural knowledge and civilizational knowledge and national knowledge. if anything, I think it signals a decolonization of the mind. It challenges Tibetans to engage Tibet at a more intellectual level, but also on a practical level in terms of like, I think the youth movements to create, Plus, for example, it's primarily to use these groups as an avenue to engage Tibetan history, Tibetan language, Tibetan music, Tibetan theater. If anything, I think it becomes a medium for engaging Tibetan epistemological knowledges. So I think it's actually really powerful. And I think it can get even deeper. So Lhakar Diaries started in 2011. It was motivated by the Lhakar movement. It was heavily, uh, you know, inspired by what was going on inside Tibet, the level of cultural resistance that was happening following the 2008 uprising, and then the self-immolation movements. A lot of it was, in many ways inspiring and powerful, but it was also demoralizing because a lot of people in Tibet were being targeted by the state. So Lhakar in many ways became an avenue for celebrating our culture and history. And so, me and my friends, we were, extremely inspired by that itself. And Lhakar Diaries itself is our own initiative. So, it's our own individual commitment to the Lhakar movement as those inside, promoted it. So to me personally, Lhakar is a cultural empowerment movement, and it can be expressed in any medium so long as it engages Tibet. So for me, that can be multiple sorts of things. Primarily for me, I think what I tried to do every Wednesday was to actually, take the time to consciously think about Tibet, and then think about, okay, how do I want to engage people who follow me on Lhakar Diaries? And the way that I decided to do that was to engage knowledges on Tibet. So I've invited my audience to participate in the kind of intellectual and knowledge endeavors that I have engaged concerning Tibet. If anything, I think I see it as a way for, I'm learning about Tibet, as a grad student, and I'm publishing articles here and there. And Lhakar Diaries becomes a good avenue for me to not only, engage an audience that might be interested in the subject of Tibet, but also, share the kind of knowledges that I'm learning too. So ultimately, that's how I see my participation on Lhakar Diaries. But Lhakar Diaries as a medium itself, if you look at the different authors and the guest posts, you'll notice that we all take on different kinds of ways of engaging Tibet. My post recently has been more engaged with the kind of scholarship that I've been researching. So it's my way of sharing that knowledge with my readers. But you'll notice other readers engage Tibet poetically or artistically, or through art mediums. So for me, I think Lhakar Diaries helps audience kind of imagine how they would think about Tibet and how they engage with Tibet. And it doesn't necessarily prescribe any specific way to engage Lhakar. If anything, I think it says as long as you take out the time and energy to think about Tibet more consciously, it invites, I think, readers to think about Tibet, in terms of how they want to engage Tibet.